Hello everybody, thank you very much indeed for coming. Welcome to Wolfson and welcome in particular to the Oxford Centre for Life Writing. I'm Kate Kennedy, I'm the co-director here, and I'm really delighted to welcome you to the second in our series of 3 events that we're calling Beyond Music. The series is conceived by Felix Appelby, who is our wonderful sponsor this evening. And I'd like to thank him very much for his vision and for his enthusiasm in creating and supporting this series. Felix's vision is to mix disciplines and in doing so to create new unexpected dynamics for us all here tonight. And I think that by putting these 2 speakers together, that's precisely what's going to happen. Neither of these will be your average common or garden talk on musicology. They are both fabulous, avant-garde, exciting and fascinating. And I'm really excited to share them with you. First of all, we'll have Matthew Sheeran, who will be talking to us about imaginary music made possible. Matthew is a composer and arranger. He studied at Sussex and he works between commercial and non-commercial music. And that's sort of the space that this project inhabits. And then after that, we will hear from Robert Brewer Young, who is a luthier, instrument maker, and a philosopher. And he is also a visiting scholar here at the Life Writing Centre. This is the calibre of fabulous people we attract, and we're very proud to have him. He will be talking about the lives of instruments. I'm not even going to tell you what he's going to talk about, but it will be wonderful and very interesting indeed. We'll then have some questions afterwards, so save your thoughts for them both collectively. And if you didn't get a chance to tell them how wonderfully they spoke, there will be a chance over wine afterwards in, I think, the cafe directly outside. So do please join us for that. Hopefully you've got access there to our term sheet of other events coming up. And if you're not on our mailing list, do please speak to me or sign up so that you get information about all other events. There is something for everyone. So, Matthew, thank you very much indeed for starting us off tonight.
Thank you, Kate, and can I also thank Felix Appelby for all he's done to sponsor this talk and organise it. It's very inspiring. Okay, so today I'm going to be talking to you about microtonal music, and we'll explain what that is. So up there we can see a visualisation of some of the music I'm going to be talking about, and during this talk we're going to be seeing many animated videos which should illustrate some of these things. Okay. So I'm just going to read this quote. Imagine drawing a sweeping landscape, Chicago's lovely skyline, say, or maybe a sunset, but you're stuck using crayons. If pressed, what would you sooner reach for, a pack of 12, pack of colours, or a 64 pack? In visual art, the answer is obvious. Colour is a spectrum, so why not capture more of it? Musical pitch is a spectrum too. So microtones, the notes between the cracks. So if you look at the piano, you've got 12 notes, you've got 5 black notes and 7 white notes. But in between the cracks, there are other notes, an infinite amount of notes, also known as out of tune, but we'll come to that later. So here's a photo of some parrots. So in the first photo, that is using a full palette of colour. And the bottom photo is only using 12 colours. As I was saying, in music we have 12 pitches in most music you'll hear, historically. All right, now this is Jacob Collier, he's going to explain about microtones.
An easy way to explain microtones is through a game that I often play just for fun. I like playing games for fun. You take 2 notes, G and E. How many notes can you fit between these 2 notes? On the piano, there are 2 notes between, right? What happens if we try and squeeze in more notes? Right? Right, you can go forever. These are all microtones. These are notes that you can't find on the piano.
So that's Jacob explaining it better than I can. So as I was saying earlier, we have 12 notes. So we divide the octave into 12 equal parts. We divide other things into 12 as well. So for example, the time, 12 hours on the clock, 12 months in the year. I know some months have different numbers of days, but let's just forget about that for now. So I've got a picture of a piano there, and also the guitar. So the guitar has 12 frets per octave, but we don't necessarily have to divide it into 12. So during the French Revolution, there were 10 days in a week, which they tried for a couple of years. And then on Mars, apparently there were 28 months in a year, rather than 12. This is a guitar. It has 22 frets per octave instead of 12. So those would all be microtones. This is a piano, which, if you know about the piano, it has a different configuration than you're used to. You don't have 2 black and then 3 black. You've got 5 black. So that's got 11 notes per octave. Let's just skip all this. So this is the composer we'll be talking about, Easley Blackwood. So he was born in 1933. He actually died last year, very sadly. His father was a very famous bridge player. So there's a bridge player called Easley Blackwood as well. So if you know about your bridge, you'll have heard of him, the Blackwood Convention. And he studied with Nadia Boulanger, Olivier Messiaen, and Paul Hindemith, who are 3 giants of 20th century composition and teaching. And he is based in Chicago. So when he was a small boy, there was this train that used to go past his house every day, and there was a chord that the train whistle would play. And he wanted to find this chord on the piano, but he could only find 3 of the notes, and the 4th note, it wasn't there. So I'm just going to play that chord. So that's the chord. So the top note, the F, not quite F, let's say, that kind of got him interested in whether there were other notes that he hadn't been taught about. And so he wrote these pieces in the 1980s, the 12 microtonal etudes. He wrote them for synthesizer because that was the only thing that could play microtonal music that he wanted to write in those days. And he's exploring dividing the octave into between 13 and 24 notes, and we'll get into what that means. So, as I said, with the clock, we can divide the clock into 12, but we could also divide it into 13. Like, what would that be like if we had 13 hours in a day? What sort of world would that be? It'd be very different, wouldn't it? But if we divided it into 16, it'd be a little bit more similar, because we can still divide it into 4 and things. So Blackwood, he uses these microtonal scales to write music in historical styles, such as Baroque and classical and romantic, but these are with different notes, but they still have many things in common with music that's already been written. So it's kind of like an alternate, it's an American term, alternate history of music. So I'm just going to play this is from 1980, so this is him playing it on a synthesizer. And this uses 21 notes to the octave, and it's in a sort of Baroque style. You don't need to read sheet music, but if you can read sheet music, these are not normal notes. You will not recognize any of these accidentals. So. So he's playing every part there. You can see, I'll just go back to that. You can see in the score, he's recommending instruments. It's played by a synthesizer, but he's recommending recorders and viols. So the score, and then this next one, we can see enormous flute solo, background. So this isn't like a normal score where you say what instruments there. Now he's using his own notation for this. It's incredibly hard to read. Any musicians in the audience will see some of these double sharps, etc., and be horrified. And you're right to be horrified. Here is a visualization of one of the pieces done by Stephen Malinowski, who has a YouTube channel where he makes animated videos of Beethoven and. This is very strange music, especially on first hearing. So in the preface to the score, he says, "Execution by conventional instruments, acoustic instruments, is not advised." So this music he never envisaged as being played by real human beings on acoustic instruments. He did not believe that was possible. This is in 1980. But we're in 2024 now. There's been a lot of technological change. It is possible to play microtonal music. For example, this was a piece that I wrote for harp where the harp was retuned. So we're just going to listen to the scale. So that would be an example of retuning an instrument. So this is, we're now going to talk about how I recorded these pieces using acoustic instruments for a chamber orchestra. So these are all the players. But first we're going to talk about auto-tune. So auto-tune was a technology that was discovered by someone that was basically... They were a deep C miner, and the technology was for deep C mining, and he realized that it could be used also for autotune. So autotune in pop music is, let's say someone can't sing in tune, that doesn't matter. You can just you can just correct it on the computer, or you can use it as a creative effect, as famously done by Cher in 1998. So some of you might recognize this. This was a big hit. So yeah, this is technology, it's mainly used in pop music. That's sort of what it's designed for. So I'm using it in a way it wasn't sort of intended for. Well, it was intended in a way, but it's mainly...
John what?
So Budapest Scoring, they're the orchestra that did the recording. They mainly do commercial music, which is how I came to know them. So they did Okja, Parasite, Squid Game, Wednesday, Mission Impossible, etc. So they're really good at sight reading and recording, and they're used to this sort of unconventional type of approach. So what I did is I translated this music into notes that the players could play, and then on the computer auto-tuned or de-auto-tuned it to the notes, the microtonal notes. So on the screen, the notes that are coloured in, those are what the musicians played, and the notes in the diamonds above them are the microtonal notes. And what I have to do is drag those on the computer so that it's the same note. Doesn't actually look like that on the computer. It looks like this. This is Melodyne software. Okay, so this is one of my This is, the players are playing normally, so this is before it's been retuned. This piece is, so there are 12 pieces. They're all in different historical styles. As I said, Baroque music, classical music. This one is influenced by Indonesian gamelan, and it uses Indonesian gamelan scales, the pelog and the slendro, which are microtonal. So we're now going to listen to the microtonal version. This has been retuned on the computer. The musicians don't know that they're playing microtonal music. They don't need to know that. They're just playing what they've been given, and then it's actually helpful for them not to know that, so they just play. So as I said, these were the original recording was in 1980, played by synthesizers. So the next video we're going to see, we're going to have the original recording, and then it's going to switch to the acoustic recording. So let's just do that. So you can hear the difference between the original electronic version and the new version. So here's another, this is one of the ones I played earlier, but arranged for chamber ensemble and retuned. This is a visualization by Stephen Malinowski. So, oh sorry, I'll just go back to that last one because, just 1 second. Oops. So with this one, you can see that, you can see the stave and you can see the notes in relation to the stave, but you can see they're not sort of lining up. So the stave is designed for 12 notes. So some of them line up and then some of them don't, because 16 has some of the same factors as 12. So there's some notes in common. There's 4 notes in common, but then all the other ones are different. This one's 18 notes. So this is in a sort of like Stravinsky's Firebird or Daphnis and Chloe by Ravel. It's in that sort of style. So there's a lot of whole tone scales and things like that. Very, very difficult to play. the musicians suffered quite a lot recording that one, but it all worked out. Now we're going to show a slightly different visualization, which is going to show modulation, which is when we change key, and we change key very, very quickly in this. So you'll see the notes go crazy at one point, and that's indicating that we're moving from one key to another. At the beginning, you'll see that it's not really doing anything. That's because it's staying in that key. The keys are at the bottom. That's the end of that one. So that one's quite similar to 12, the normal system we have. There's many things in common, so that doesn't sound as strange as perhaps this one. So this one is the Baroque one that I mentioned before. And then we're going to look at the 18 notes again. So this is with the musicians playing. You can see which instrument is playing which bit. You can see all the instruments, and then so this one's probably the most popular one. So this one is sort of in maybe style of Ravel, perhaps. So this is very fun. Changing key every time it's moving. It's changing key very, very frequently, every sort of 8 bars, which isn't that common. So this is the slow movement of the Baroque suite. It's very lovely. You'll notice that the musicians are sort of playing more than one part. This is known as overdubbing, and there's a technical reason for this. In order to do the retuning, every part has to be acoustically isolated. So we couldn't have the musicians in the same room; they had to be in isolation booths. Which is quite unnatural for them to do, but it also meant that they could play more than one part. They had headphones on, they could hear each other. There were windows where they could see each other between the isolation booths, and there was a click track, and there was a screen with the bar and the beat and everything. So that was how that was possible. But it was probably not very comfortable to do. This was during COVID though, so it was very COVID safe. So Anyway, Easley Blackwood. So he was quite sort of conservative and kind of not that open-minded. But through doing this recording, he had contact with professional studios, and he says that he's not particularly fond of rock music or any of the other popular styles. But I think it'd be a very healthy thing if there could be a rapprochement of some sort between classical and popular music. Going the route that I did with this project and doing the synthesis in a professional studio, I came into contact with that other world, and I found that there were some fascinating, talented individuals working what you might call commercial music, the likes of which most of my colleagues never meet. I found the contact with these people tremendously stimulating, and I'd have to echo that. This would never have happened without the knowledge of what can be done in commercial music, these auto-tuning software and professional studios, isolation booths, etc. So this is the album, Acoustic Microtonal it's called. So this is with Say D Records. This came out in January. There's 12 tracks, all in a different style, all in a different tuning system. And okay, so that's the end of Easley Blackwood. We have a little bit of time now, so I'll talk about what happened after Blackwood wrote these microtonal etudes. So the etudes they're actually tonal. They're in a tonal style, but they're microtonal. And this actually radically changed Blackwood's thinking about music in general. And after writing the etudes, he became a very conservative tonal composer, writing in the historical styles such as Schubert. Here's a really lovely example of a sonata for guitar he wrote. This is the first piece he wrote after the microtonal etudes. So this isn't microtonal, this is tonal. It's quite unusual for composers to make such a radical shift. So I'm now going to play you, as we've got time, some other microtonal music. This is by Nicola Vicentino, 1511 to 1576. Yes, they were writing microtonal music in those days, and it is now possible to play this. You'll see some strange signs on the score, so those are the microtonal notes. So I'm just going to play that. So I think he's doing what we call word painting. So Gesualdo does this as well, writing very sort of tortured sounding music, because that's what's in the words. So next we've got Mildred Cooper, who's using quarter tone. So quarter tone is half a semitone. So semitone, there are 12 semitones, there's 12 notes. So this is using 24 notes to the octave. So this is sort of early 20th century. Next we've got Harry Partch. So he's using microtonal scales from ancient Greece, because the music of ancient Greece was microtonal. They had various scales and they left this information, so he reconstructed some of their instruments. Most non-Western music is microtonal, so it's in tune to them, maybe out of tune to us, but perhaps we are also out of tune to them, so it's all relative. What should we listen to next? Yeah, so this is King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard. This is a very popular track they did. That one's called Rattlesnake. This one's by Sevish, a sort of drum and bass. This is very popular. What I'm trying to sort of say is that microtonality isn't a genre. Every genre can be, like you can have microtonal jazz, microtonal baroque music. Here's another pop song, Brendan Burns. There's 22 notes to the octave. Brendan's a commercial composer. He does the music for many well-known podcasts, such as You Must Remember This, but he's also microtonal. This is Dolores Caterino. She uses hundreds and hundreds of notes per octave. She's probably the most extreme, but also probably one of the more accessible. She has various keyboards. You'll be able to see. It's a spectrum. We're going to look at another piece by her. So this is using 106 notes to the octave. So they're 12 normally. So it's her own special keyboard. So it's very futuristic sort of sound. Here's a guitar, also played by Brendan Burns. So this is on a guitar which has 27 frets instead of 12. None of the music I've been playing you is atonal music, which is what many people might think when they hear the word microtonal. This is this instrument is amazing. It's called an infinitone. It's connected to a. This is using 31 notes per octave. And then lastly, we're going to listen to a piece I wrote, the harp piece, where the harp's been retuned. Okay, and that's the end of the talk. Thank you very much.
Can we turn the mics off on the stand to stop the feedback? Oops. Thanks.
The cello we just got to hear started the day in Cremona in Italy. It made its way to Milan before sunrise and eventually ended up in London and arrived here around 3 o'clock. Cremona, of course, is the birthplace of Antonio Stradivari, and the instrument actually references his work in many different ways. And every part of the instrument actually has a Baroque technology that is used in order to create an instrument out of donated and recycled materials that can be constructed as part of an ongoing conversation around craft in order to create instruments and make them available to children for free. The idea is to make a conservatory quality instrument that can be manufactured on site by the recipients in the community and that they can then bring it to life. It's also the fruit of a dialogue that Kate and I have been having for years now. And it poses the question of authorship for me in a very interesting way. We are here at the Oxford Centre for Life Writing, And the idea of writing always implies that there's an author. And for me, this cello poses the question of who is the author of this instrument. It refers to a historical figure in many aspects of its construction. That, of course, is Antonio Stradivari. But it also refers to a more immediate, a more practical, and a more living dialogue that you and I have been having, that we've been having with others, that we've been having with our own children who've been involved in the process of making this instrument, documenting it, and bringing it to life. And the question of authorship is particularly interesting to me, especially in the context of life writing, because there's always the question for me of when an author signs his name, what names are being effaced? If one of us were to write our names inside the cello, what names would be effaced in the process of doing so? And when I counted how many hands have actually gone into creating this object, I came up with about 32 to 36 different hands that have been involved in different stages of creating this instrument. And it brings us back to a very 19th century romantic notion of the artist in the attic, like Baudelaire, or the writer in the basement, like Edgar Allan Poe, the solitary genius. And what does it mean to continue this mythology in reference to objects that are created by groups of people, by families in which some of the members are effaced, or in workshops where the assistants are not valued? I have thought a lot for a long time about the work of Rodin and his active partner, collaborator, and someone who was very involved in his work, Camille Claudel. And I remember seeing The Gates of Hell for the first time in Paris and noting her hand and the unique gestures of her work that were present in many places in that. But of course her name was effaced from the work. And in thinking about the question of authorship, it makes me think about different possibilities. What does it mean to write a story and include other authors, to include other names, and to actually pay tribute to the people who are actually involved in the process? Does it mean to unseat the idea, the mythology of the lone and solitary genius? And what does it mean in the life and work of someone like Antonio Stradivari, who is, of course, the mythological, celebrated, I would say, most renowned craftsman in the Western world? He was part of a family. He had two sons that were working alongside him actively until the end of his life. They were in his 70s, he was in his 90s, and I was in the workshop. When you begin to look closely at his work that evolved over a period of 70 years and more, where he was wonderfully active and actively engaged in conversation with his own children, with the community, with composers, and with musicians who were making actual demands, an interesting question is how did he respond, and who is answering the question alongside him? And one of the things about the instrument that, of course, is very interesting to me is what were the demands being made by the community? What were the demands that were being made by economy? And what were the demands being made by the musicians of the day? And it was a question that became very important and very relevant to me as an apprentice violin maker, is how do we respond to the needs and demands of the musicians who are actually confronting on an everyday basis? And I became very interested in that question and started thinking about different ways of working with instruments, working with materials, and addressing the question of craft during the siege of Sarajevo. Because I was working very closely with the Kirov Opera, and some of the members had family actually in Sarajevo, and they were performing during a time of war. And they approached me and said, could I prepare fingerboards and bridges? Could I actually use craft in a way to address the needs of musicians who are addressing everyday violence and able to perform and continue their art in a time in which that art was being threatened in a very real way. And it was also providing hope, providing livelihood, providing possibilities to a community at large. And I began thinking about this question much more deeply and went around to all the violin shops in New York and banged on the door, and I had a box and I said, fill it up with strings, fill it up with bridges, fill it up with whatever you can. Those things went off to Sarajevo, they became used, we prepared fingerboards and did various things, and the next year we filled up 3 boxes and included some instruments. At the time, I was thinking about the needs of musicians. I was taking the subway from the Lower East Side in New York to Carnegie Hall. I was an apprentice in a very French domain above Carnegie Hall, where English was forbidden at times, which was quite fun. And on the subways in New York, I saw that there were an enormous number, more than 10, blind musicians who were actually performing, busking, and making a livelihood that way. So I thought, craft means something in this context. What does it mean to cut a new bridge, to tune the instrument, to actually provide them with another instrument if possible? And how can I deal with this question as a craftsperson who is learning a trade and trying to address the needs of musicians who I'm seeing on an everyday basis? So I ended up having my first clientele in New York above Carnegie Hall, which was a group of blind musicians who would bang on the door and I would repair their instruments and rehear their bows for free. And my boss found that very curious, but I did it late at night and on the weekend, so it didn't disturb the everyday life of the workshop. But word got around that this was happening, and the blind school in New York contacted me and said, would I come and look at the closet of instruments they had because they wanted to start an orchestra. So I went and I saw this incredible pool of riches in the form of instruments, and with apprentices and other people, we ended up fixing these instruments and helping them to create an orchestra. Word got around even more, and we were contacted by the blind school in Calcutta. And they had an extraordinary program where they would help children to learn to play an instrument, and they would be guaranteed employment when they graduated from high school. So again, the contact between local composers who were working with these children, with the musicians themselves, and the possibility we had as craftspeople in order to fix instruments on site or to prepare instruments for them to play, became something very, very lively, important, and immediate for me to do. So this has been happening, and it's been happening for the last 25 and 30 years, and I've been slowly doing this work and putting it into place. And I wanted to expand this project and to think about the possibilities that were created by craft, that were created by dialogue, and to think about how interaction could actually make this scalable, to make it farther reaching, and to make it reach communities in further flung places, some of which were actually my own backyard. At the time when I was an apprentice, the Upper East Side was kind of like a demilitarized zone in New York, and I realized that there were an enormous number of instruments in basements scattered around the city that had been bought in the 1950s. So we started fixing those for kids in the neighborhoods and starting to see an incredible effect on the level of violence in communities. So music, instruments, and craft became a very immediate way to respond to the problem of violence. And what I saw continually is the immediate impact and possibility of that. This was spoken to by a teacher in South America who I got to work with in a very underserved community that had one of the most thriving orchestras I've been a part of, where if you join the orchestra, you're not allowed to sell drugs and you're not allowed to be in a gang. And she said, having a cello in this neighborhood or a violin on your back is like wearing a bulletproof vest. And she was very serious about that. And she said, how can you help us to make more bulletproof vests? So this was a really interesting challenge to me as a craftsperson. How do I help people to have instruments that engage them in a way that reduces the level of violence in the community, that involves them in a conversation with music, that involves them in a conversation with each other, that changes family and community dynamics? And the obvious answer was to find instruments and bring them there. So I went to China and I started working in a family workshop, and I got wood there and I moved in with this family and we were making instruments and bringing them from China to New York, setting them up and varnishing them and then bringing them to Argentina. This does not seem scalable, and it certainly does not seem sustainable. And we started to become very interested in the ecology of the instruments. Where are these materials from? How are they being made? Are they being recycled? Are the forests actually being clear cut? And looking closer at the dynamics and the ecology of the instrument made that whole model troubling from a different perspective. So we started to think as craftspeople, and this is where this cello comes in, of how can we address this question of providing conservatory quality instruments to underserved communities and make it possible for people to engage in this conversation in a meaningful way. And one of the most meaningful things we have begun to find is getting people involved in the construction of their own instrument makes them ask other questions. If I can make a rare instrument, If we can make a cello together, what else can we do? So it opens a box of possibility. And the capacity to make something that makes a sound that engages one with music and with a community in a new way actually brings to light other kinds of questions that I think are of particular interest. And so we began to engage with technology. We're using, of course, Baroque technologies. Everything in this cello refers to 17th and 18th century craft techniques. And yet, to make it scalable, to create a form of distributed manufacturing, we needed to go to the very other end of the spectrum and start working with high-tech precision machines. So during the pandemic, the Cambridge Department of Engineering was gracious enough to take on a crazy project like this and to start helping us to mill plates that could be assembled on site. Kate calls this the flat pack cello. And because my IKEA resistance at first had a really hard time with that, the name was difficult to engage with, but then I discovered that Stradivari made the flat back cello. So there was a nice correspondence between the two. And we wanted to see if it was possible to actually make this project truly scalable, to create a dialogue with history, with the work, trade, form, design, and function of an instrument like a Stradivari, and to bring this into a contemporary context in a new, and I would say extremely disruptive way. Because what happens, and what we're finding is happening continually in blind tests, is that these instruments are of a quality where they propose a disruptive challenge to the economy of instrument making and sales. And the idea that one needs a rarefied multi-million-dollar instrument in order to play the music of Bach on stage. This cello actually had its debut, Kate and I were in Wigmore Hall 2 weeks ago, and it actually had its debut on stage in Wigmore Hall with Kate and the soloist Thomas Deming, and it held up wonderfully well. So the use and the engagement with technology is basically chapter 3 of this story, and it's the one that we're writing now. I'm very fortunate to work with Sebastian Gonzalez, who's here with us. He is a physicist and acoustic musical researcher at the Stradivari Museum in Cremona. He came with me from Cremona this morning, and we're looking at ways of doing 3D scans, modular analysis, looking into the form and function of these instruments in order to push the boundaries of possibility, to make these instruments more widely accessible, and to constantly challenge the idea of greatness by making things out of recycled, donated, upcycled, repurposed materials that are actually producing sounds that are truly excellent and making music available. And so this is the project we're working on, and for me, in the context of being here as part of the lives of instruments, this instrument has a life, and the life of this instrument is just beginning. We were in the museum last week, and Sebastian actually did a scan of the instrument. There will be some creation of different forms of analysis that will be applied to its next version, and that will ameliorate and in some ways enhance certain acoustic qualities, and finding ways to engage with the contemporary technologies in terms of production and analysis, with the goal of actually having children be able to take a tool in their hand and do this, and be involved in creating their own instrument, instead of sitting here and always using their hands to do this. So it's actually a different way of thinking about community, creation, and actually our own bodies and our engagement with the objects that we play and that serve music and then serve a kind of dialogue that we have been involved in. And so it's been a real honor to be here and to explore these themes and to explore the sort of boundaries of possibility of craft, creation, and conversation. And this particular cello, when Kate and I were working on it, she has been writing a book on the cello. And this instrument actually features in the book in a way that I find quite wonderful. And so we had a poem written that Kate had suggested on the instrument that I would actually ask you to read.
So this was a wonderful surprise to me, because the book that I've just written is It's called Cello, A Journey Through Silence to Sound. And I wanted to take the idea of the instrument's relationship to its player, of the fact that this thing is a body double. It's the same size as a human torso. It has the same tessitura as the human voice. And yet it is separate and it is separable from its player. So what happens when that relationship is complicated? What happens when a player is lost and the instrument survives, or vice versa, or when someone is unable to play? And I started my book with a poem by Ursula Wood, better known as Ursula Vaughan Williams, Vaughan Williams' second wife, who was a wonderful poet. And she wrote a poem called To a Cellist. And the second stanza of which Robert had painted onto the cello, which was a complete surprise to me. I didn't know he was going to do it. And it was a wonderful tribute. The book became an instrument, whereas the book had been drawn from the instrument. And Ursula writes, thinking about this relationship between cello and person, like a centaur, sort of half horse, half man, half cello, half person. Composite being, man's intelligence and tautened strings on wooden shell, sets free voice beyond speech or words' close boundary, to shape a world in logic of pure sense, to comprehend beyond experience silence and sound in measured harmony.
Thank you. I'm very interested to hear from you and to hear how this lands with you and to hear any questions that may come up. Because again, this instrument is the fruit of a dialogue, and the dialogue is being written as we speak. It's being written here, it's being written by us, it's been written with Sebastian, it's being written in a very active way in workshops that we will see expanding in different places around the world. But the thinking and the conversation behind it are an essential aspect to the process of creation. And with that, I would love to open it up to questions and to a larger conversation amongst all of us, and also with Matt, if he would like to join me and address some of these things together. Thank you.
We have a microphone about to rove, so do put your hand up if there's anything you'd like to ask. And Illyri will come to you. Perhaps just with the microphone if you can, it's hard for people to hear. Thanks.
Thank you. This is a point I'd like to ask Matthew about. I've actually studied the polyphonic singing tradition of Georgia, the country. I don't know if you have any acquaintanceship with it.
I've heard it. I've seen it live as well. I think the scale they use is...
Yes, it's based on the Pythagorean natural interval of the fifth, divided into 4 equal tones. So you have a quarter tone diminished second, a neutral third, and a quarter tone augmented fourth. And there are still people who can sing in those modes. And in fact, they're trying to train young people by isolating them from our more modern equal temperament scale and actually getting them to preserve this. And when you hear it in 3-part harmony, as you probably have done, it really sounds quite amazing. So the point I'd like to draw from that is that the concept of microtonality surely is a derivative of the equal temperament scales that we're so familiar with, whereas in fact in ancient music it was there all the time. In Georgian, in the Armenian Sharagan chant you might have heard of as well. There are lots of different modes as well, and you mentioned the gamelan in other, particularly the Eastern Oriental traditions. So it was never, it isn't a modern invention by any means, yes.
In fact, the equal tempered system is the equal tempered system. Hello? Can you hear me? The equal tempered system, that's the sort of artificial, that's more modern than, as you were saying, Pythagoras, etc. It's a massive, massive topic. It's impossible to sort of cover everything, but, there's most non-Western music has its own microtonal scale that it's using, sort of exposure to Western pop music has kind of caused a lot of problems in that these traditions are now dying because people are used to hearing the 12-note scale. But perhaps you would probably know more than me, though. What do you think?
Yes, I'd be happy to talk to you more.
Yeah, we'll chat later, yeah.
Please.
There's a question here at the front.
I think I might.
Oh, you might.
Okay, I was going to ask, are there any acoustic instruments that are typically, typically, as in very commonly, that you can very commonly use them for more notes in an octave than the usual 12.
Yeah, so the violin, for example, people are playing these other notes a lot of the time. We call it playing. So yeah, the cello. Did you want to play some out of tune notes?
I'll see what I can do. Yeah. So that's an E. That's it. So like that. With
open string, the D string, and that.
then. Yeah.
Yeah, so the violin, the cello, the string family, obviously non-Western instruments, they're tuned using different scales, so that would be normal. There are different types of guitars with different frets. You just take the fretboard off and put a new one. I think the guitar is probably the easiest microtonal instrument. It's possibly the easiest non-microtonal instrument as well.
Other thoughts or questions?
Matthew, much of the works that you showed included wind instruments, where there is a hole or several holes, and the mechanics are that you press the key and it closes the hole completely. So maybe there are some technical constraints on being able to produce microtonal music with these wind instruments, where they've been, in a sense, assembled so that they only play a true note. Maybe you can comment on that.
I'm not a wind player, but my understanding is that depending on what fingering you do, you can get some microtonal notes. You can't get all of them, which is why the music that I was playing, it wouldn't have been possible for wind instruments, but it may have been possible for string players, that they would have had to practice for years, but it would have been technically possible to learn how to play it.
Sorry, could you pass this down?
Yeah, I've heard from people who've played in high school wind bands and so on. Occasionally a conductor will irritate them no end by saying, well, you know, your instruments are easy, you just push and play, and in which case they will then just push and play, and the chords will be dreadfully out of tune, because again you're dealing you know, you have to cope with the paradoxes of all the you know, the perfect fifth and the perfect fourth fitting inside an octave, which it can't, and all of that. So each scale ends up getting twisted very, very slightly, and again, if all you're doing is filling the hole, you're not going to get it.
We have a question here.
Just a little comment going back to the violin. I don't really know at what point it was introduced into India as a live performing instrument, but it's rather noteworthy that with the sitar and with most of the Indian wind instruments, the notes are somewhat discrete, the pitches are somewhat preordained, discrete, with frets and all the rest of it. But of course, the violin has ended up as the exemplary microtonal instrument for classical Indian music. And it's rather wonderful.
It's called the sarangi, isn't it? The Indian violin. And I think, off the top of my head, I think they have about 22 notes to the octave, but they're not. It's not an equal division of the octave, I believe. But I'm not an expert at all.
Thanks. I enjoy maths and thinking about how you translate or transpose the notes on the microtonal scales. But I keep coming back to, as I'm listening to the examples, oh, thank God it's a normal sounding tune as opposed to the microtonal tunes. And I'd be quite curious to sort of challenge myself to find the beauty in certain types of microtonal music. I was in Bali over New Year and I got woken up in the middle of the night by some of the gamelan music, and it was kind of haunting and awful, but also somehow, wonderful as well. How can I think about the fact that I'm struggling with sort of finding the beauty in these microtonal music? I guess microtonal music can be awful, as much as normal music can be awful.
It can be awful.
Yeah.
Most baroque music is being forgotten. What you say is very interesting, because it takes a bit of time you need to listen to it more than once. It'd be like trying some food that you've never had before. You might not like it the first time, and then a year later it's your favourite food. I mean, Kate, you're a classically trained musician. How did you feel hearing everything out of tune? Have you got used to it?
No, it completely does my head in.
Yeah. But maybe speak more to that. What about you, Robert?
I mean, my experience is more with the maqam scales and with Arabic music, where quarter tones are, highly developed, which is perhaps a more accessible way into microtonal music. But that's something that I'm more familiar with. And the maqam scale is, highly developed in terms of differing ascending and descending scales using different microtones. And I think that that's a way that someone who's been, let's say, force-fed 12-tone music can open themselves and experience that kind of music in a way that's more accessible.
But it's interesting that the more narrow-minded, classically trained musicians like me, who find that kind of, because I've got perfect pitch, it's like nails on a blackboard.
Blackboard actually has a perfect pitch.
That's fascinating. But particularly playing baroque music, we're very often asked to tune intervals narrower or wider to suit. And so we are experimenting with microtones in a way. A very narrow third is pushing into the microtones below the third.
So a melodic third would be different from a harmonic third, depending on all sorts of contexts.
Yeah.
So in a way, you're not playing 12 notes at all, you're playing many more.
Exactly. And many early pianofortes had split black keys as well, so they could accommodate that.
Alice?
Take advantage of the fact I have a microphone. I just wanted to come in on that, which may not work. There we go. As a violin player, we are always playing microtones, because an F sharp is not the same note as a G flat. And I'm both a violinist and a pianist. Yeah, exactly. So on a piano, you just do it. But yeah, and I used to also sing in several, chapel choirs and things. And you're constantly adjusting what you're doing. So without calling it microtones, you are essentially playing them all the time.
Yeah, so the choir will sing in tune, but it plays so in tune that by the end of the piece, it will be, the pitch will have shifted down, because it didn't play the 12 notes. It's very sort of counterintuitive.
Just as the keys change throughout a piece of music, when you start in G, your G is different to a G when you're playing in, F, for example. Yeah. It's a different note, and pianists don't realise that.
Very, very complicated. Pianists.
So I have a slight variation on the way that we've been approaching this question, which was going back to your opening remark about colours and gradations of colour. And I was thinking that if you showed me a grade of red that I'd never seen before, it wouldn't make me feel ill, I suppose. But the music you were playing definitely had a sort of woozy effect on me. So I wondered why you thought music would make me woozy, where colour wouldn't.
Let's say you lived in the early 20th century, late 19th century, and you saw some Fauvis paintings. You've never seen these colours before, they're new chemicals, etc. A lot of the people at that time would have seen that as very radical. It was very sort of jarring. Now it's normal. So we're sort of culturally conditioned in a way, perhaps. I'm not sure. It's okay not to like it, 100%.
Please.
Thank you. I have an answer to how you deal with gamelan music, and you just eat one of their magic mushrooms. It really works very well. But I wanted to ask about ancient Greek music, because how do you know what it's supposed to sound like? Because I think someone in Oxford has been working on this, haven't they? Amandagor, Jesus, maybe? And he wasn't quite... I mean, how did you decide?
So with the ancient Greek music, they said that they were sort of tuning manuals, how they tune the strings of like the lyres and things. So that's how we know what the notes are. We don't necessarily know what the music is. There's very little that's been left. There's the Song of Psychos, which is the most famous, but there's very little. There's sort of fragments of this music. It's very modal, sort of like Dorian mode type sort of stuff. Ancient Roman music, I don't think there's hardly any at all. But yeah, they're able to know certain things. But music, unlike art, if you don't write it down, it's gone forever.
You have a question, please.
Yes. Could you comment on how traditionally trained violin makers respond to your work? Because they're struggling to produce luxury art objects which are always compared with the hugely valuable ancient instruments. And you're doing something a bit contrasting, and how do they respond to your work?
I mean, I would say I embody that paradox, because my day job is making luxury, good, high-end instruments for soloists, and that's how I pay the rent and raise children. And this is doing something very, very different. I think the technology has always proposed challenges to the traditional idea of craft. And we're wrestling with questions now because of the advances in technology that we think are remarkably unique. But a lot of these things have been taking place, a lot of these conversations, dynamics, and challenges to a craft economy have been taking place for centuries. And it's really interesting looking into furniture making and silversmithing in the 19th century, and to see how the application of technology was considered very, very disruptive to craft economy, but how it allowed certain people within craft circles to emphasize elements in their own work that were unique in a way, design work that was being done by hand on top of spindle-produced, lathe-machined silver work, for example. So it's an old question, but it's a very, very real one. What happens when you begin to CNC with very high accuracy plates where the traditional techniques are not superseded, but certainly rivaled? And there's a disruptive element in it, which I think is significant. The fact that these instruments are non-commercial, they're also a slightly odd shape. I mean, they're based on a Stradivari that was played by Joshua Bell that was guitar-shaped. They look a little bit out of the ordinary. They're not being sold, and actually attaching a price tag to them puts the recipients in danger, because if you're carrying something around on your shoulder in certain communities that's worth X number of thousands of pounds, there's an issue there for security and safety for the communities. And so actually creating a space for a different kind of exchange and a different kind of question around craft and its purpose does allow for the luxury economy of craft to continue, which it does. But I think that the next 3 to 5 years in that space are going to be again, disruptive in a way that will be interesting to explore. Having said that, when the Strad magazine started publishing posters of instruments with very, very fine measurements and outlines, and suddenly it was like, but we have these archives that we've worked for decades, if not centuries, to create. Suddenly they're being widely available, and the instruments will be mass produced, and it's going to disrupt the whole industry. Well, for me, that was a great thing, because for my own children, I couldn't afford to have a luxury good produced for them, but there were fantastic workshops in different countries using those posters and raising the level from the ground up in terms of quality of instrument production. That's also my hope here, as we'll be applying technologies and forms of analysis and production that will actually raise the level of production, even for the higher end, and push it a little bit higher. So it will propose a challenge. an economic challenge. It will propose a challenge in terms of the space that's created for instruments that might be purchased or not. And but the interesting part of that exchange for me is the challenge that's produced in terms of augmenting quality in contemporary goods and actually making it truly disruptive by challenging the idea that only an old instrument can function for a contemporary soloist or a great kid who wants to go off to conservatoire. So, but it's interesting to me how old the questions are. And when the water-powered saw came along, people were saying that tree milling was going to be completely disrupted, the whole economy of that. Yeah. So, but yes.
Matthew, a few weeks ago, some of us in this room were absolutely transfixed by a conversation you had with Janet Baker when you presented a lot of this evening's material, and she was utterly transfixed and very, very positive about your work. And she, of course, has always been motivated by the power of music as an expression of words and meaning. And she asked you about that, and what sort of plans do you have in that direction? Words, poetry, microtonal.
Well, none of these arrangements were for voice, but this technology, the autotune technology, it was designed for voices. So hopefully in the future this can be explored. Perhaps someone could write a new piece that we could record using voices. But I think it would work very, very well with voices. But just that there was in one of the scores it did suggest exotic voices, but it was very, very had to be very economical with how many instruments we could use. We could only record 3 at a time in the isolation booth. So so hopefully that will be explored in the future.
Yeah, I've got a question which is somewhere between craft and acoustic physics, and so it might also be for Dr. Gonzalez. Once you've used high-quality CNC machines, that's fine. Can you then fine-tune the instrument by doing, for example, laser interferometry, and then back-engineering and enhancing the quality of the instrument that you've just produced by increasing thicknesses or changing varnish in different places, either outside or inside the instrument? Because you might be able to see it with the computer. You could do a Fourier transform, you could look at the wave patterns, and actually truly enhance the instrument.
I mean, it's a remarkably complex system, an instrument, and any violin maker or physicist who says that if you do this as an input, you will get this as an output in such a complex system, I would question their, I would ask questions around that. Having said that, it's an active research project. Is what can we actually do? What can we find out about these functions of these instruments? How can we overlay analytical tools that we have access to? How do they relate to intuition, which is something Sebastian talks about quite a bit? And how do we explore these possibilities in order to have more predictable possibilities in terms of augmenting sound in relation to a certain concept of sound? And there's still an enormous amount of subjectivity in the domain. The language used to describe it is variable amongst cultures and amongst communities. And what we're actually looking for remains an open question. How to get there remains a very open question. But the analytical tools are being brought to bear and shedding some light on what could become possible. Having said that, yesterday we had a really beautiful experience of doing an acoustic analysis of a violin by Antonio Stradivari made in the 1690s. And we did a readout, basically, with a program that we have and a sort of rig that we have for doing acoustic analysis. We cut a new bridge for it and did it again, and there were interesting changes. We can't say exactly what they mean. We can say that certain areas that seemed to relate to overtones were highlighted, and that the musicians who played it afterwards, there was some form of consensus around that. So I think there are interesting possibilities that we're at the very outset of being able to explore, to describe, and to put into place. But it's an exciting domain. And again, for me, trying to apply those tools and resources to a project like this in order to make high quality sound in reference to a particular notion of quality more widely available is disruptively exciting. So,
yes. Okay. I've got a question for Matthew, because my question will be, what's your perspective of the microtone with the envelope? I mean, not the envelope for the letters, but the envelope from the hit, sustain, and fade. And what is more closer to the microtone, the cymatics or the envelope?
I don't quite understand the question. Do you understand the question? The envelope.
Yeah, the envelope is normally used in DAWs like Max, MSP,
okay.
and Ableton, something like that. Yeah. So it's like more like signal. It's very micro cut of a piece of sound to a micro level. But the microtone you're referring to, I want to know what's your perspective on that, or the cymatics of the vibrations which have the surface vibrate.
I'm sorry, I don't understand the question. Perhaps we can speak afterwards. But I think I could understand the question. It's just hard to hear, and I didn't understand the terminology. I'm not
one for over drinks.
Yeah. I'm not very technical. I mean, I can do Melodyne, but that's about it.
Okay, we're at our final question.
Yes. Please.
Thanks. This perhaps is a question for Matt, but also interested to hear the thoughts of the others. With the rise of generative artificial intelligence effectively commoditizing the ability to produce standard music with algorithms trained on existing work, and as you've pointed out, the large majority of existing work is musical work is in what do you call it, sort of normal 12th style.
Recorded, yeah.
Yeah, recorded music, digitalized recorded music. I was at an event the other day where one of the speakers used AI to complete the Beethoven's incomplete work. I forget the name of the specific work, but I think there was a very small amount of the song that was actually written, and it was imperceptible where the AI kicked in and completed the work.
My understanding is that humans were still involved in that.
Yes, true.
So that's not.
Yeah, you're familiar with that project.
Yeah.
That project was kicked
off. Was
off.
that the 10th Symphony?
Yeah, it was. I think it was kicked off in like 2019 or 2017, so pre the current phase of generative AI. But I'm going to run the assumption that that stuff effectively becomes commoditized over the coming few years. Do you see the realm of semitones as being a very rich, unexplored area because there's not so much digitalized music, and one maybe that we might find a whole sort of a new future beyond this kind of commoditized music?
Absolutely. I mean, Easley Blackwood, the composer who wrote this music, he stopped writing microtonal music immediately after writing these pieces, and then went back to tonal music because he realized from writing these pieces that there were chord sequences and ways about thinking about tonal music which he'd never thought about, which the early 20th century composers had missed. So there's definitely a lot to explore with the standard 12-tone system for sure. When it comes to AI, from my understanding, they're not anywhere near where they are with text when it comes to music. I do believe they will get there, but they've not written anything good yet with music. But I think they will eventually, and so handling something like microtonal music, which is very difficult for humans, I imagine would be very easy for AI. So I'm sure they will compose some very interesting pieces with 71 notes to the octave or something. They'll also probably write some incredibly addictive pop music. They'll be able to nail that, and I imagine that will be the main sort of focal point for AI in music from a commercial perspective. I also imagine that they'll be able to listen to every recording ever done and be able to mimic the style of great violinists like Heifetz. You just give them some sheet music and they'll play it as though Heifetz is playing it, something Heifetz never played. But I don't know when this will happen, but I believe that. Thoughts, Robert?
I mean, just on the human scale, what you were talking about is imitating Heifetz. And because I'm in contact with live musicians and instruments, I mean, it's an interesting question, and where it will go, I think, also in terms of pedagogy is very interesting. How will music be taught in a world of generative AI? But one of the things that's been quite exciting for me is seeing young musicians from different parts of the world play like people who were in their 60s in the 1920s. And this is because of access to recordings, to YouTube, etc. And that's been pretty thrilling. And so for me, one of the interesting questions around that is how it will affect pedagogy and the possibilities for performance. On that note, I thought we might finish with a piece of music. Kate would be willing.
Okay.
Thank you so much for coming. Hope you enjoyed it.
Thank you very much for the questions. Bravo, bravo. Bravo.